On the 23 October 642 on the slopes of Edgehill in Warwickshire, the army of King Charles, I met in open battle for the first time with the forces of Parliament commanded by Robert de Vaux, 3rd Earl of Essex. The cause was clear. The king needed to open the road to London before Parliament could tighten its grip on power. Essex had to stop him. Neither side had another choice. If one army broke that day, the war might have ended in its very first year. Early on the morning of 23 October, the Royalists occupied the crest of Edgehill, a long ridge with gentle slopes descending towards the wide fields leading to the village of Kinneton. From the high ground, Charles I could survey the entire southern plain. The terrain allowed him to see clearly each column of parliamentarian troops advancing below. At the center stood the infantry under the Earl of Lindsay, formed into dense pike and shot blocks, long pikes protecting ranks of musketeers. On the right wing were the elite cavalry of Prince Rupert. On the left, the horse commanded by Sir Henry Wilmot. The artillery was positioned along the edge of the ridge, guns angled downward towards the plain. Around early afternoon, Parliament's army appeared at the foot of the hill. Essex did not attempt to attack a hill he knew climbing under artillery fire would be suicide. Instead, he deployed his forces parallel to the enemy on level ground. At the center were the London-trained bands and regular regiments. On the wing stood cavalry less experienced than their Royalist counterparts. The artillery was pushed forward to answer the guns above. The two armies stood nearly a kilometer apart. The weather was dry, the ground firm, ideal conditions for cavalry maneuver. Charles I hesitated. Holding the high ground meant safety, but he might lose the chance to shatter the enemy before they withdrew. Around 2 o'clock, the decision was made. The entire army would advance downhill. Royalist infantry began descending the slope in tight formation. The artillery opened first, cannonballs bouncing down from the heights and tearing through Parliament's ranks. The thunder of guns echoed across the hillside. Essex ordered his men to hold their ground. His infantry stood firm, pikes raised like a forest of steel. When the distance closed to a few hundred meters, Prince Rupert on the right wing did not wait for further instruction. He lowered his sword. The Royalist cavalry surged downhill. More than 1,000 horsemen charged like a breaking flood, gathering speed as they descended. The pounding of hooves rolled like thunder. Opposite them, Parliament's cavalry began to falter. At a few dozen meters, pistols fired wildly. Then came the direct collision. The parliamentarian line broke almost immediately. Rupert did not pause to reorganize. He led his men in deep pursuit, driving the fleeing remnants far from the field. On the Royalist left, Wilmot launched his own cavalry charge. The pattern repeated itself. Parliament's horse could not hold and fled the field. Within less than half an hour, both of Essex's wings were virtually shattered. But the center still stood. In the middle of the field, the infantry of both sides collided. Pike blocks drove into one another. Musketeers fired at close range, gunpowder smoke choking the air. By now both Royalist cavalry wings had ridden far from the center in pursuit. From the ridge, Charles had no mobile force left to protect his infantry's flanks. Gaps began to appear. And at the center, far from the glory of sweeping cavalry charges, the battle began to turn. As both Royalist cavalry wings vanished in pursuit, the center became the point upon which survival depended. Lindsay's infantry had reached the foot of the hill. The pike and shot formations spread into large blocks. Pikemen and musketeers interspersed. Drums beat steadily. Officers shouted to maintain order. On the flat ground before Kinneton, only a few dozen meters separated them from Parliament's infantry. Artillery on both sides continued firing, though with diminishing accuracy. Shot flew blindly through thickening smoke. Visibility fell rapidly. When the men could see each other's faces, musketeers unleashed coordinated volleys. The first volleys staggered the front ranks on both sides. Men fell. The lines closed. No one withdrew. Lindsay ordered the advance. The two infantry masses crashed together like wooden walls colliding. Long pikes thrust relentlessly. Rear ranks pressed forward, turning the center into a dense mass of men pushing and killing at such close quarters that careful aim was impossible. On Parliament's side, the London-trained bands displayed remarkable discipline. They did not abandon their position despite the collapse of both wings. Essex rode behind the center, calm and controlled, reinforcing threatened points. Then disaster struck the Royalists. The Earl of Lindsay, commanding the center, was shot and fell from his horse. News of his wounding spread rapidly through the ranks. In a battle already chaotic, the loss of a commander during direct engagement slowed the Royalist momentum. Coordination faltered. Some Royalist units pushed too far forward, exposing their flanks. Others halted, uncertain without fresh orders. Essex saw the opportunity. He ordered reserve units at the center formations not yet fully committed to drive into the disordered sections of the Royalist line. Drums sounded. Parliament's pikes thrust diagonally into exposed flanks. At one point, the Royalist center began to give ground step by step. Not a rout, but the initiative was slipping away. Smoke grew so thick that men were visible only as shadows. The shouting, the clash of steel, the irregular crack of muskets merged into a continuous roar. Meanwhile, the Royalist cavalry, far off in pursuit, did not immediately return. Rupert had driven Parliament's horse miles from the field, even attacking baggage trains. His forces scattered in plunder and pursuit, losing cohesion. At the center, Royalist infantry began to tire. They had descended the slope and fought continuously under pressure from two sides. Without cavalry to guard their flanks, the danger of encirclement loomed. The most perilous moment came late in the afternoon. Part of the Royalist center was driven back towards the foot of the hill. Parliament forces pressed close to the Royalist artillery and captured several guns. Had they possessed sufficient cavalry to exploit the breakthrough, the Royalist army might have been crushed entirely. But Parliament had problems of its own. Their cavalry had been routed early in the battle and had not reorganized in time. Essex lacked the mobile force to exploit the opening. Both sides grappled on in exhaustion. The late afternoon light slanted across Kinneton Field. The central formations of both armies were torn into fragments, yet neither collapsed completely. Then in the distance behind the battlefield, dust began to rise. The Royalist cavalry was returning. Late in the afternoon, as the sun sank in the west, Edgehill had become a sprawling chaos from the foot of the ridge to near Kinneton. The once neat pike and shot formations were now scattered clusters of pikemen and musketeers clinging together in thick smoke. From the north and northwest, Royalist cavalry reappeared. Prince Rupert, having pursued too far and dispersed his men in plunder, had finally gathered part of his force and returned. But the formation was no longer intact. Small groups arrived in fragments. Cohesion lost. Even so, their reappearance had an immediate psychological effect. At the center, the retreating Royalist infantry steadied. Seeing their cavalry banners behind the enemy, morale revived. Officers shouted to hold firm. Pikes lowered in preparation. Essex recognized the danger. His infantry, spread thin after hours of fighting, now had exposed flanks. If the Royalist horse struck at the right moment, the entire center might be split apart. Rupert did not hesitate. The first cavalry squadrons charged into Parliament units near the foot of the hill. This time they lacked the downhill momentum of earlier, but their target was disordered and exhausted infantry. Collisions came in fading light. Cavalry pierced through musketeers unable to reload in time. Some Parliament units wavered. Guns recently captured had to be abandoned as gunners fled. Yet Rupert lacked sufficient numbers for a decisive blow. Many horsemen had not returned. Those who had were tired, their mounts spent, their formations loose. They struck hard, but not continuously. Essex reacted swiftly. He pulled remaining reserves inward, forming a dense defensive mass. Pikes bristled together. Musketeers fired at close range into slowing cavalry waves. Several charges were halted by forests of steel. The battlefield dissolved into isolated clashes. No clear lines remained. Groups of a few hundred fought amid smoke and bodies. Cries of "For the King" and "For Parliament" rang out in confusion. The light continued to fade. Shortly after 6 in the evening, darkness settled over Kinneton Field. Neither side could organize a final assault. Artillery ceased fire. Targets were invisible. Cavalry dared not plunge into chaotic darkness. Gradually, the musket fire dwindled. The two armies disengaged in exhaustion. Night fell completely. Both Royalists and Parliamentarians camped on or near the field, not far from one another. Bodies lay scattered between the lines. More than 1,000 men were dead or gravely wounded. The next morning, no battle resumed. Charles I still held the original high ground, but he had not destroyed Parliament's army. Essex maintained his force intact and withdrew in good order towards Warwick and then London. Tactically, neither side had won a decisive victory. Strategically, however, the king's golden opportunity had slipped away. He had failed to break the blocking force. London remained beyond his reach. Edgehill ended not with a single crushing blow, but with mutual exhaustion in the dark. It was the bloody beginning of a civil war that would last for years, not a series of short, decisive battles, but a slow and grinding attrition of an entire kingdom.